Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Lauren, for having me back. Well, folks, it's that time of year again when the world gets to experience what I call seasonal joy. The period from November the 1st to January the 13th represents a time of celebrations for over six other major world religions, with about 29 separate holidays and festivals being celebrated around the world at this time. Of course, quite often evangelicals point to this time as being a war in Christmas because we say other things other than have Merry Christmas to each other. But I don't see that as a war in Christmas. I see it as a broadening of the awareness of the many places around the world where seasonal joy can be enjoyed. And so when I see my Jewish friends, I say Happy Hanukkah. When I see uh, my African American friends, I say Happy Kwanzaa. When I go to my local grocery where there's an Indian man who owns it, I tell him Happy Diwali, and he's happy that I say that. And of course, I say Happy Christmas to my Christian friends. And for those that I have no idea what their persuasions or affiliations are, I just simply say Happy Holidays. And I think that's wonderful. So today I am here to look at the birth of Jesus and to look at the nativity in reference to other nativities. Now, let me get my slides ready. Mary's miracle baby and all the nativities. You know, birth has been referred to as the earliest miracle of human life. And before the science of fertilization and conception and gestation were fully understood, birth was looked upon as a miracle, a gift from God. Even after we've had scientific advancements and we understand the principles of these processes that happen, there is something very special. There's something very sacred about bringing new life into the world. Of course, in biblical times, when there was a birth, there was a grand celebration. The whole, not just the family or the clan, but the entire village would come out to celebrate the new arrival. And of course, in biblical times, conversely, barrenness was viewed as the greatest curse for a woman. Now, according to Webster's dictionary, nativity means the process or fact or circumstances such as time, place, or manner of being born. Of course, there are many nativities or birth stories in the Bible. When we refer to the nativity with a capital T and a capital N, we're referring, of course, to the nativity of Jesus Christ. But there are many other nativities in the Bible. The question is, what does the nativity of Jesus have in comparison to or in reference to other nativities in the Bible? Generally, I think you'll be surprised at how many parallels there are between Jesus' nativity and the others that are in the Bible. Now, in biblical literature, the birth story or nativity is a distinct literary genre with its own features and its own characteristics. Now, because of the individual uniqueness of each character in a biblical narrative, it is quite possible that not every birth story has all the characteristics, but most birth stories have most of these characteristics. And so let us look at the first aspect of this, which is the plot of a birth story in the Bible. First, a barren wife or couple desires a child. Next, a messenger from God, sometimes an angel, appears and promises a son. The birth occurs, often accompanied by supernatural events. But then hostile forces threaten the life of the child. But God protects the child, and so he grows to adulthood. And then he becomes a great hero or deliverer or savior. Now, let us see how these characteristics play out in the nativities of some others in the Bible. Fertility and matriarchy was a big issue back in those times. Look at Sarah. Sarah had no children. I'm not going to be reading every single text here because that would take too much time. But notice that it says she was childless, had no children, because the Lord has kept me from having children, she says. Then there is Rebecca. Isaac prayers on behalf of his wife because she was childless. Rachel, I like this particular one because it does emphasize how barrenness was viewed in biblical times. She says to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." And Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children?" Then Manoah's wife, Manoah, the mother of Samson, she was childless, unable to give birth. Hannah, the mother of Samuel, says here, Hannah had no children. The Lord had closed her womb. Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, she was childless, not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Now, do you think that this was a coincidence? All of these women had trouble getting pregnant. Every one of these matriarchs seemed to have had a problem getting pregnant. Was there some kind of a genetic predisposition to infertility, you think? No, this is merely a literary device. Whenever in biblical literature you see a reference or mention of a mother, of a woman being unable to give birth, it was a sure sign that a great man was about to be conceived. It was a foreshadowing of the birth of a great person. Now, after the barrenness, then you have, before the miracle, pregnancy, a messenger from God promises a son. It happened in the case of Sarah, mother of Isaac, Manoah's wife, mother of Samson, Elizabeth, mother of John the Baptist, and Mary. Now, Mary, okay, the birth occurs oftentimes with supernatural events. It happens with Sarah, Rachel, Manoah's wife, Anna, Elizabeth. And then hostile forces threaten the child. In the case of Joseph, it was his own brothers. Behold, the dreamer cometh, let us kill him and see what cometh of his dreams. For Samson, as a young man, it was a lion he met on his first trip to the big city of Timnah. And for Moses, it was Pharaoh's ordering the slaughter of all boy babies of the Hebrews. And for Jesus, it was Herod's killing of all boy babies 2 years and under in Judea. So finally, God protects, not finally, but then God protects the child from these threats on his life. So Joseph is sold as a slave instead of being killed. Samson gets superhuman strength to kill the lion. Moses is rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. And Jesus' parents receive a vision to flee to Egypt to escape Herod's treachery. Finally, all of these grow up to be great leaders, patriarchs. And the rest, as they say, is ancient history. Now, as you can see, Jesus' nativity had much in common with other biblical nativities. However, there are two features of Jesus' nativity that are not typical of the other nativities in the Bible. First, other biblical nativities do not involve God's mating with mortals. That was not a feature of other biblical nativities. And second, a virgin birth. Now, interestingly, it is on these two features that differentiate Jesus' nativity from those in the Bible that Jesus' nativity has common ground with many non-biblical nativities. What does the nativity of Jesus have in common with non-biblical nativities? First of all, if you go back to the Sumerians, who are widely regarded as one of the earliest human civilizations occupying the lower section of Mesopotamia, their aristocracy claimed to have been of divine origin. For example, Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, was considered two-thirds divine and one-third human because his mother was Ninsun, who was a goddess, and his father, Lugalgamba, was a mortal king. And Gilgamesh supposedly had two-thirds divinity and one-third humanity. And then in ancient Middle Eastern worldview, there wasn't a hard and fast barrier between mortals and humans. Gods could become mortal and humans could become gods. Of course, this persisted even to biblical times, and we find this rather curious statement over here. Well, let me back that up. In biblical times, we had, let me get this slide. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, it says that the sons of God mated with the daughters of men and produced a race of Nephilim, or giants, in those days. So even in the Bible, there are references to God's mating with mortals. Not totally strange as concept. Now, coming closer to classical times, we have this story of Danae. Here, Zeus, in a golden shower, impregnated Danae and produced Perseus, for example, another demigod, as it were. In a golden shower, he got her pregnant. She was locked away by her father, so she wouldn't be able to have any children. You might remember that story, I don't know. But this resulted in Perseus. Interesting thought, this golden shower, used in a different way in modern times. And then Zeus also, in the form of a swan, he seduced Leda, or Leda. Leda was the queen of Sparta. And one day she was sitting by a pond, and this swan swam up to her, and she was just a beautiful swan. She started petting the swan, which thereupon raped her. And from Leda and the swan was conceived Helen of Troy. You might remember Helen, the face that could launch 1,000 ships. You might remember reference to her. Then there are other progeny from Zeus, like Hercules, the son of Zeus, and Alcmere. And there was, of course, Helen of Troy. Minos, the king of Crete, was supposed to have been the offspring of Zeus and a mortal woman. Now, so we do have long precedents for mortals mating with gods, or vice versa, long before Jesus's conception. These are some of the illustrations. Oh, here is that quotation I was getting to earlier. There were giants in the earth in those days when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Here's a biblical passage that talks about the mating of gods with mortals. And then there are many people who see parallels between Leda being impregnated by the swan and Mary, with a dove descending upon her to impregnate her to produce Jesus. They see parallels between those two occasions. Now, coming closer to classical times, we have Pythagoras, who was said to have been born of a virgin. And these were characters who achieved greatness and who were retroactively referred to as having been the products of virgin births. We have Plato, we have Apollonius, we have Scipio the Elder, Caesar Augustus, Alexander the Great, no relation to me as far as I know. All these people were supposed to have been the product of virgin births. And I have Apollonius, and by the way, all of these predated Jesus by centuries, as you can see on the dates there. Now, Apollonius I included because Apollonius might have overlapped in time with Jesus, because he was a first century of the Common Era personality, and yet he was designated as having been the product of virgin birth, which is to show that the concept persisted even into the time of Jesus, because Apollonius probably overlapped Jesus by a few years, as far as we know. Now, if you take a look at the production, the timeline in the production of scriptures, take a look at the bottom of your screen. The earliest Christian writings, of course, are those of St. Paul. Now, Paul's writings between the year 50 to 65, they are the closest writings to the time of Jesus. And yet Paul seems to have no awareness of any of the birth story of Jesus. There's no mention of Mary or Joseph. He does not have a birth story. There's no virgin birth, no Bethlehem, no Nazareth. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, he just makes a passing mention of that he was born of a woman. Jesus was born of a woman. In other words, born like everyone else. Then we come to the writing of the Gospel of Mark, around 70 of the Common Era. Mark doesn't have a birth story either. Jesus emerges in Judea just as a grown man. There's no birth story for him at all. And then we come to Matthew, and then we have the story of the Magi and the star. And then we have Luke, of course, which talks about the shepherds coming to Jesus's manger when he was born. Now, John, the last gospel, doesn't mention anything at all about Jesus being born of a virgin. It doesn't mention Mary. There's no mention of Mary at all. So if you look at the progression, there seems to be a progression over time in the understanding of Jesus's divinity, and or others might say there is a progression in the development of the legendary aspects of Jesus's life that can be traced from the time of Paul and how it developed gradually over to when you get to the part of John, where John says, oh, he wasn't born, he wasn't divine when he was baptized, as in Mark. He wasn't divine when he was born, as in Matthew and Luke. He was divine from the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were created by him, and without him there was not anything created that was created. So we have a progression in the understanding of the divinity of Jesus from his birth, or even before his birth. Now, you'll notice that Matthew, the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, wrote around the year 80 of the Common Era. So 80 years passed before anything was written down, apparently, of Jesus's birth. Now, there was oral tradition all along. And sometime, or rather around the time of 85th year of the Common Era, Luke decided that he was going to write the story of Jesus's life, including his birth. Luke chapter 1, verse 1 says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So Luke is saying, hey, I have had some sources. I've heard some of these stories myself, and I have had talks with people who were closer to the time of Jesus. And so I'm writing my account of his life. Now, what can we take away from all of this that have transpired so far? Let's look at what conclusions can be drawn from what we have seen so far. First, Bible writers could perceive their their own culture, or sorry, their reality through the lenses of their own culture and ethnicity and geography. The perspectives we see in the Bible have to do with how Bible writers saw reality. And so sometimes when we read the Bible, we have to consider whether or not what we're reading is a direct revelation from God as to how we should live and what we should do, or whether we're reading a reflection of Middle Eastern culture at the time. Nativities are written about males only. There are no nativities written about a great military leader like Deborah, or a diplomat like Esther, or Rahab, the best undercover, and I use that word with tongue in cheek, the best undercover agent you ever had, Rahab. No mention about her, no nativity for her, no nativity for Ruth, and none for Mary. And I find that interesting. Now, in the case of Mary, this is rather ironic because there are a few mentions of Mary throughout Matthew and throughout Luke, but no birth story. Now, in Catholic tradition, Mary was conceived in St. Anne. Her mother's name was Anne, or St. Anne. And when Gregor Mendel, the Catholic priest who was one of the pioneers of genetics, when he discovered that every human being has 23 different pairs of chromosomes, so that it became clear that Mary's chromosomes would have mixed with God's to produce Jesus, that Jesus would therefore have some mortal chromosomes in him, possibly sinful. Then the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary was born in the Catholic Church. They declared, without any explanation that I know of, that Mary was immaculately conceived so that she could be a fit vessel to bring into the world the Son of God. And that's as much as we know in Christendom about Mary. And yet, what is really ironic to me is that in the Quran, in the Islamic tradition, Mary has a much higher profile than in the Christian tradition. In the Quran, there are over 70 references to Mary, and she is referred to as the greatest woman in the history of the world. And not only that, she is the only woman in the Quran that is ever mentioned by name. Mary is the only female mentioned by name in the Quran. And yet, we generally think of, at least I do, think of Islam as being a repressive religion with reference to women. We tend to think that women in Islamic cultures tend to be repressed. But here, Mary has an entire chapter in the Quran referring to her, dedicated to her. There's a reason for that, I would submit, but I digress. Next, only the birth of sons seems to reverse the curse of infertility. Nowhere in any of these nativities do we have a woman being blessed with the birth of a daughter. It's always the birth of a son. Of course, it has to do with the patriarchy. That was the dominant mindset of the people during that time and in that place. And so it's not very surprising that that was the case. Now, how do we account for all these parallels between the nativities that we see in the Bible with the nativity of Jesus in particular? We have to understand that a great man, in the mind of a Hebrew, in the Hebrew mind, a great man must have a great beginning. And so, decades, sometimes centuries after a man has achieved greatness, a birth story is developed that reflects the greatness of the man. And that's perhaps why we see these many parallels in the birth stories of so many great men in the Bible. Then, as we pointed out, Jesus' nativity has similarities to many non biblical nativities. Now, one thing from a strictly Judeo Christian point of view that should be pointed out is that the parallels we see in these nativities would suggest that this is how God intervened. MO, that God creates these miracle pregnancies to make sure that the people do not take their leaders for granted, that their leaders are special gifts from God to the nation. And that's one explanation, perhaps, for why the nativities are the way they are. And finally, the birth story of Jesus may not have been as unique as we have thought all along. But the fact is, it is the last nativity. It is the climactic birth story. It is the one that introduces the ultimate hero, the ultimate deliverer, the ultimate savior of humankind. And with that, I'd like to end here, and perhaps we could have some discussions further on what the implications of these are.
All right. Well, thank you. That was very interesting. I have to say, I have never heard of any other virgin birth stories. I've never heard of any God versus human combinations. I know my husband's family studied Gilgamesh quite a lot when he was a kid. So it's interesting to hear that. But this is all very interesting. I'm going to start with Lauren just because you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'll start by throwing in a couple of things here. We are still two things. I don't see my friend, my Adventist Today business partner Bjorn here today, so I'm going to throw in here. We are still in our year-end fundraising, and we depend on that a lot, folks. If we're going to keep going for another year, I hate to be a beggar for money. It's not my style, but it's pretty important. I'm really proud of what we do. We depend on this a lot. And I know what happens to me is I'll say, "Oh, I should give some money to this organization or this people. Yeah, I can give some money to them," and then I don't get around to it. It's like it goes out of my mind and I forget. Don't forget this year, please. Uh, remember us. Give us a little something. If you've enjoyed the class, please pitch in. Okay, second thing, uh, coming up next week, we are going to go on with the Christmas theme. This time, particularly, this is going to be more of a language study with Warren Alexander, or Warren, sorry, Horace, Warren
Richard.
Trenchard. Uh, going to be a language study, and we're going to be going into the virgin passages in Isaiah and how they were passed over into the New Testament and all of that. So that should be interesting. The young woman studies. Uh, the week after that, I've got a really interesting guy named Hans Gutierrez from the Adventist College in Florence, Italy, is coming. I don't think anybody's had Hans Gutierrez speak before, so I'm really looking forward to that. And then the week after that, I've got Colby Martin, and we are also going to be doing Colby Martin. He's the guy who wrote the book called Unclobber about the what they call the clobber texts for LGBTQ, and he's going to be speaking. And we had him in one of our very first Adventist Day Sabbath seminars. Okay, now back to the topic. I'm sorry about the advertisements, but back to the topic. Horace, something occurred to me as you were talking. There's so many questions I have. Like Gina, I had heard a little bit about this. I think I'd heard Alexander the Great was supposed to be a god man because of his greatness. And I've always assumed, and I think properly, that a lot of these uh, things were ascribed to them after the fact. And you made that case very well, I think. Even Jesus is not written of as uh, a God man until somewhat later. Um, but here's something that crossed my mind, and I wonder if there's anything. How do we mark great men now? What is the circumstance of great men? And if you look at Americans, have you noticed that all of the great men in American history somehow came from poverty and became great by kind of pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps?
Mm.
In Europe, a great man was born to be great as a king. He was part of the royal family. His father was royal, his mother was royal. But you come to America, why was Abraham Lincoln so great? He was born in a log cabin. George Washington, we saw his greatness as a child. He was not born as royalty, he was born as an ordinary man, and he became great. I think that's kind of an interesting concept that maybe there are other ways in our more egalitarian world for people to become great. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, you know the popular saying, some men are born great, some men achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them.
Yes, 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 yes.
And perhaps the ones that are born great were born or with a silver spoon in their mouths. Perhaps some of our current leaders in the United States were born with a silver spoon in their mouths and either use that in a negative way or in a way that maintains their hegemony. But I think there is something to be said for the humble beginnings. So you have Jesus being born in a manger, you have
Hmm.
Moses being in a basket, and you have others from Abraham Lincoln in a log cabin. I think that kind of greatness is true greatness because it shows that a person can achieve, even from humble beginnings, and make a big difference in the lives of others around them and not just the elite from which they may have come. And so I think that's probably one of the reasons why at least I do tend to revere those who were born in humble circumstances, who aspired to greatness in service to others and finally achieved it. And I think Jesus was an embodiment of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's absolutely right. So many of them came from humble beginnings. And you look at King David. King David, humble beginning. Saul was tall and handsome. King David was the young, the runt of
Yeah.
the group, and yet we see him killing the Goliath, and after that he kind of, which is another thing interesting. Sometimes these origin stories were not quite consistent because we also have Goliath killed in a different situation in a different book. But we
Yes.
need David to be a giant killer in order to make him a great king. It's
Yes.
very interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
you really have stimulated my thinking about this.
Well, one of the reasons why many of us from the field of education, which is the field from which I come, the reason why we find education fulfilling as a career is because we see extraordinary possibilities in ordinary people. I go to the car wash and I see the gentleman who is wiping my car down, and I'm thinking, if I were to give this man an education and put a three-piece suit on him, he could step into any corporate office and hold his own and run a business. It the potential, the human potential for in ordinary people is just extraordinary. And if we can see people that way, I think we'd have a lot more respect and a lot more regard for fellow human beings than we do now.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Horace. This is a really interesting thing to think about. People's origins versus how they turn out.
Yes.
And right now, we're in a setting in the United States where we've had a series of people who, not all of them, but a series of people who, as George Bush once said, and Art just wrote this, Molly Ivins rather said about George Bush, he was born on third base and thought he hit a triple. Um, we have people like that. Um, but again, Barack Obama, that was a, humble beginning. People said, "Oh, he came from this mixed family." Uh, for a while, I wasn't sure where his birth certificate was, uh, but he became something great. Same with Bill Clinton. It's funny that the Democratic presidents have been born in humble circumstances, and the Republicans seem to uh, have come from money. I don't know. It's just an interesting thought. Anyway, thank you, Horace. This was very interesting.
I'm interested also in what our European friends have to say. Is there a different interpretation? Lauren's talking about great men, and I'm also going to hope there may be some great women somewhere in the United States, but I'm interested in hearing about just ideas about what makes people great in other parts of the world, Europe, the Caribbean, Africa. I have one hand up, so help me out here. Linda, can you unmute yourself? I think I need to invite you to unmute here. There you go.
Thanks, Gina. Horace, you are just a storyteller par excellence. I always love your presentations because you weave such a wonderful story. Forgive me if I'm a little wearied about discussion of great men, but I do have a question. I'm a little puzzled by what I thought I heard you say when you talked about a woman being barren as a precursor to the birth of what would ultimately become a great man. Are you suggesting that the barren, of course, that wouldn't apply to Mary because she was too young to have been perceived as barren. She wasn't in an intimate relationship at the point where she conceived. So, of the women you described, is barrenness in those circumstances a God induced condition? Or is it revisionist history that they're identified as barren post the emergence of a great man? I wonder if you could say a little more about that for me.
I'll be happy to. Regarding Mary, by the way, Mary, of course, was not barren, but she, like all the other matriarchs, she conceived a child under miraculous circumstances. So in every birth story, there's always a miraculous pregnancy. Every baby is a miracle baby. So that explains where Mary fits into the scheme there of the barrenness being characteristic of the others, but not of her. But her pregnancy was like the others in the sense that it was a miraculous pregnancy, and therefore Jesus's birth was a miraculous birth. But then barrenness in biblical literature is almost always followed up by a miraculous pregnancy. And that is the reason why I refer to it as a literary device. I do not believe there was some genetic predisposition toward infertility among the women of Israel. I don't believe that for a minute. I believe these were stories made up to celebrate the greatness of a man, and that one of the ways to do that is to make him look as if he was a miracle birth. And the only way to do that was to have the woman be perceived as barren.
Okay, thus revisionist history is what you're saying in essence, then.
Yes, it is
That's what you
revisionist
mean
history.
by a literary device.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Linda. And Chris, I apologize. I missed your hand because it, for some reason, put you up above Horace's name, which is not usual. But I see you there now, and I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the presentation, Dr. Alexander. Some time ago, I looked at that same Old Testament listing of barren women, and then how the script is flipped in the birth of Jesus. She's not a barren woman; she's a virgin woman, according to the story. Just a comment, really, not so much a question. That I think there are others. They may not be birth stories, but the story of James and John being called from mending their nets, doing the humble fisherman work, to becoming apostles, and Peter and Andrew as well. And Matthew, despised tax collector, is exalted to be the author of one of the Gospels eventually. What came to my mind, and like your comment on that, is David's story. We don't know much about his birth other than he's the despised shepherd boy. But David's origin story, I think, would go back into the book of Ruth, where a Moabitess, even a despised Moabitess, is grafted in through that amazing story of her commitment to Naomi, David's great-great-grandmother, if you will, coming into Israel. So his origin story even goes back farther than that, at least. That's my thinking on that. And I'd like your comment on that. And also the comment now, I read something this week about, Jesus's mother, that the whole virgin story is a concocted story to give a divine origin to Jesus rather than a factual event. And that would be something that the historical critical people of the world would say is just really not true. There's no way that would have happened. Comment on that, if you would be helpful.
Okay, let me go back to Ruth. Yes, Ruth was the ancestor of Jesus Christ. And of course, Ruth and Boaz, as a couple, had property there in Bethlehem. Where I see, and I agree with you on that, Chris, is that it is quite possible that the shepherds tending their flocks in that night of Jesus's birth could have been actually in they were in Bethlehem, which is where Ruth and Boaz lived. And Boaz being a property owner, it is quite possible and feasible that those shepherds may have been in Boaz's field that night when the shepherds made the great announcement and the great chorus of angels announcing the birth of Jesus. So there's a direct connection in my mind anyway, that there's quite a family connection possibly between Ruth and Boaz in Bethlehem, and Jesus is being born in Bethlehem and being announced there. So that's one good point. Another point that you brought up had to do with Mary. Mary's Mary was an exceptional woman. Here's where I see a thread between the prominence of Mary in Islamic scriptures and Catholic theology, and maybe Ellen G. White in Adventist theology. Whenever you have a woman who is elevated above all other humans in any way, shape, or form, it is a message from patriarchy saying, this woman was not like the rest of you. You don't even try to aspire to be like this one. This one was a virgin. This one was the greatest woman who ever lived. That's in Islam. And in Seventh-day Adventism, hey, she was a prophet. You're not a prophetess. Don't even aspire to ministry like the way she might have been perceived. So by isolating these women and putting them above the normal level of esteem that we have to all women, we are sending a message that patriarchy still rules. I don't know if that really
Wow,
addresses your question, Chris. I don't know if it does or not.
oh, that's a perspective I hadn't seen. That's very, very interesting. Yes, it's often used that way when we talk about women's ordination. Oh, yes, Ellen White had a ministerial credential, but she was also a prophet. you can't be a prophet, you're not a prophet. So ladies, don't even aspire to be a head pastor of a church or a president of a conference or something like that. A very interesting point.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
there was
yeah.
one other thought that entered my mind, but I'll put it in a chat text anyway.
Okay. Well, Chrissy also mentioned, and of course, I'm sure that Dr. Trenchard will address this next week, but regarding the virgin birth situation, um, it is well known that the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, and the reason why I phrase it this way, the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, is because we don't know who these gospel writers were. We have no idea. Those are educated guesses made by early church fathers and scholars. So we don't know for sure whether Matthew, the tax collector, was the one who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. But when Matthew was being written, the author went to Old Testament texts to try to find any text that could be applicable to the life of Jesus to show or to support the idea that he was the Messiah that would come to deliver Israel. The Gospels are by nature propagandistic. They are not necessarily historically verifiable, but they are definitely propagandistic. So when Matthew saw this statement in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, in the Hebrew, it said, and I'm no Hebrew scholar, but this is what I'm told. The Hebrew says, the young woman is with child and will bring forth a son. And the word used for young woman is alma, which means young woman. It does not mean virgin. But when the Septuagint, and I'm sure Warren next week will elaborate on this, when the Septuagint was being translated, they didn't use the word alma, they used the word betula, which means virgin. And so Matthew, the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, seemed to have used that as the pretext for saying that Mary was a virgin when Jesus was born. The Septuagint version actually used the word Parthenos for virgin. So there are many words, but the word for virgin was not in the original Hebrew, as I understand it. So anyway, that's probably revisionist history again, Linda.
Well, and Protestants, at least I do not, and taught that it was not the case. Protestants don't believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary before, during, and after the birth of Jesus. They allege that Mary was always a virgin, and it creates the bad view of sexuality and marital relations and things like that.
Yes, there are all kinds of bizarre stories coming out of early Christianity where Jesus was supposed to have been born through her Mary's ear, even so as to preserve her virginity. In other words, the
That's
hymen was still
far-fetched.
weird stories that really defy any kind of logic at all. But
My
yes,
mom was an OB nurse. She never saw that happen.
and I'm sure they didn't have cesarean sections in that time either. I doubt it. So
Thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to go to Doug Myers. Doug, go ahead and share your thoughts with us.
Well, I'm not a woman, but it would seem like that would give you a giant earache. Uh, I love your perspective on education, um, although I'm a very narrow perspective on education being transportation. It certainly resonated with me to see how you thought about how someone in a humble position could achieve greatness through education. But it led me to another thought. I wrote down here greatness to despot by virtue of power. And so maybe that's the unfortunate corollary of our time. But back to your original topic there. It reminds me of a statement that I can't remember the attribution that the Bible is true and some of it actually happened. Um,
Yes.
Several years ago, I was led to a book called An Adult Christ at Christmas, Essays on the three biblical Christmas stories by Raymond Brown. That was copyrighted the same year I got married to Teresa in 1978. So it's a while back, but it introduced me to much of what you've been saying. And it also took a thread that I didn't explicitly hear you derive, although I think I could have figured this out maybe as well, is that, the disciples in the Gospels, especially the synoptics, are always a day late and a dollar short. It seems like they are always trying to figure stuff out and looking back. And so in Mark, it's all happening in warp speed, and it sort of picks up in the adult life of Jesus. Thus, the story, the title, "The Adult Christ at Christmas." And then it seems like as these other gospel writers, admittedly, we don't know whether they were actually Matthew and Luke, but as they're pondering the story, it almost seems like they're looking back. And instead of Jesus becoming sort of divinity or authority at the baptism, they're going, oh, you know what? Maybe there was something earlier, much like you said. And so they're trying to figure out maybe there was something remarkable earlier in the life that we missed. And instead of the baptism being sort of the inauguration of this savior of Israel, they're trying to figure out if something was earlier. But what I wanted to get your take on was the author in this book brings out something I hadn't really thought of before, that the two stories, which I think Adventism tries very hard because of Ellen White's writing to sort of blend the gospel stories together, when if you really look at the synoptics and you try to put all of those together in a accurate historical context, they don't work. And so the story of Jesus in Matthew and the story of Jesus' birth in Luke, they seem to be far enough apart that you really have to work pretty hard at making those both be from the same story, weaving them together as sort of a Desire of Ages version would do of that. And I'm curious as to your thoughts about the apparent contrast between those stories that seem like they might be a stretch to have both occurred in the way that the two gospel writers wrote them. Anyway, your thoughts.
Well, there is some validity to what you're saying, because the account of Jesus's birth and the subsequent events immediately after in Matthew are not compatible with those in Luke.
Oh,
In one gospel, he's born, and then immediately he's sent off to Egypt to escape Herod's treachery.
right.
But in another gospel, he shows up not too long after in the temple to be circumcised, and for Zechariah to say, may the Lord, let us know thy servant depart in peace, because I've seen their salvation. It is impossible for him to have been in the temple and at the same time having been exiled voluntarily in Egypt. It just does not work.
Yes.
The same thing occurs with the timeline, because in one gospel he was there in the reign of Quirinius, if I pronounce it correctly, and in another case he was there when King Herod was about to declare, and those two dates are like 10 years apart. You might notice, if you noticed on the schematic I had of the dates, that Jesus was supposedly born in the year 4 BCE. Now, that's because scholars have discovered that Jesus was born 4 years earlier than we thought he did. So now we have the ridiculous ludicrous notion that Jesus was born 4 years before Christ, which is it doesn't make sense at all. But it goes to show the human element in the production of scriptures, and that we have to, when we read, we have to look within a historical context, we have to look at the cultural context, and we have to sift through all those to try to arrive at some universal principles, some enduring values that can inform us. I don't have to believe in the historicity of the nativity in every detail, but I do embrace the concept of peace on earth and goodwill to all people. Those two principles, which we are so much in dire need of in the world today.
I love that because it fits perfectly with what I'm starting to wrestle with. We're big on Daniel and Revelation, and I think the essence of that is a pushback against bad religion. And so bad religion at the time was the Caesars. They were supposed to be God on earth. And the whole idea of good news that we think was invented by Christians was pushing back against the story of Caesar. And so I'm perfectly fine with the idea that the writers of those two gospels were pushing back against the bad religion of Rome and of Caesar. And then suddenly I'm starting to understand the good news as Jesus saying, and the early writers saying, the good news isn't Caesar. It's give to Caesar what's Caesar and give to God what's God, which is another way of saying, boy, we have a different good news than the guy up in Rome who thinks he's God on earth. And so I love what you just said because it helps me recontextualize without throwing out the authentic work that historians have done to say, okay, I don't need to take it hook, line, and sinker. I need to take the good news of what this really is, that Jesus was pushing back against bad religion that had so dominated. Anyway, thank you very much. Excellent.
And thank you, Doug, for what you were saying earlier about education. And that strikes a chord with me because I do believe that for a democracy to survive,
Yes.
the populace must have a certain level of education to fully understand and to preserve the principles of democracy, which unfortunately is not the case right now. Right now, higher education is being denigrated. We have a president who says, I love the uneducated. And my goodness, I wonder if the uneducated aren't smart enough to realize that they're being insulted right now. But anyway, I'm getting a little political. Maybe that's tangential to our discussion right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. I'm going to go to George Tishy, and you've already unmuted, but before you start speaking, I just want to say I'm interested in hearing from our international community. I want to know your thoughts of how your culture deals with Jesus' Mother Mary and any other virgin birth stories. So I know we've got a lot of people here from different parts of the world, and I want to hear your point of view. So George, go ahead.
Yes, thank you again for this great presentation, Dr. Alexander, which is my middle name, actually, so we have some relationship there. It was a stimulating conversation so far, and I was stimulated to think on one aspect is the genetics involved in all this process. So just think of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve didn't have a father or a mother. They were created, according to the story in Genesis, which I have serious reservations about that, but taking it as it is there, recorded there, basically God gave them a genetic structure. The DNA, the chromosomic structure, counting and everything. And then what happened after the deterioration and all that. When we come to Christ, Christ is called the second Adam. And in my understanding, it was always that Christ came. Actually, I learned this in school, in the seminary, in my time. That was a long time ago. That Jesus came to show not that we humans have the capacity not to sin, but that Adam didn't have to sin, that he chose, Adam and Eve chose to do it. And Jesus came to show that as a second Adam, it was possible not to sin. So Adam chose it, and Christ showed that it was a choice, not something imposed on them. In Christ's case, I'm wondering if Jesus was conceived not mixing the DNAs, mixing the chromosomes and all that with the mother. If he was just conceived in terms of using Mary as a surrogate mother, that had nothing to do with Christ's nature there. What do you think about this? Because it could be that Jesus was just God disguised in a human body, not necessarily mixed everything, having everything mixed, human and divine together. He was probably fully divine. He would be fully divine. This concept of he being having a human nature, I'm not sure it comes from the Bible. I don't remember actually. May have been from Ellen White. You know, we have been bombarded for years with Ellen White statements, and at the end of the day, we don't know what it was. And so, what do you think? Any comment of my comment?
That's a fascinating notion that you have posed there, George. And I am still amused when I look at 18th century paintings of the creation and you see Adam and Eve, and they have navels. Well, for heaven's sake, if they were just created by God, they would not have had navels. But the art still show that, that they had navels. Now, Jesus was born of Mary. I am pretty sure he probably had a navel. And that goes, of course, back to the fact that he was a product of human and divine interaction. So the early church, on the Council of Nicaea, for example, had that as a great big debate. There were the Arians who felt that Jesus had nothing human about him. What we saw in the physically was an illusion, and that he was really totally human. And then there were others who were saying, no, he was totally divine, and vice versa. So that's where we ended up with the notion, well, he was both. And let's not try to explain it. It's a mystery. So the Council of Nicaea, 325 or 327, whatever year that was, decided that Jesus was both God and man at the same time. But of course, when we go back now, as you referred to, back to the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were placed, and they were perfect. They were perfect. But then, of course, this brings up some real heavy theological implications. Mm-hmm. And that is that, first of all, if our universe is perfect, then any change would be imperfection. If something is perfect, it means it's fully developed and it's fully flawless. So any change, whatever, from Eden would have been sin. And then if you get back to, I know we're getting some heavy theological issues here, because when there was nothing, in the beginning there was nothing, and then God created. I know this is going to sound radical to a lot of people. If God hadn't created the possibility or the alternative or the option to sin, then it could not have existed. If God didn't create the possibility of sin, then sin could not exist, because before God there was nothing. And so the concept of sin must have originated in the mind of God. Mm-hmm. Is that a radical thought? But then, when you look at the Garden of Eden, since you referenced that, God put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden and told man not to eat of it. Now, the tension I feel is that if the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is what makes a person aware of good and evil, then how can the first couple be penalized on all of us for the rest of humanity for having eaten the fruit when we would not have yet known good and evil? Do you see the contradiction? Do you see the tension that I'm referring to? How could you be punished for doing something that you hadn't yet become aware of as being bad, as being evil, because you hadn't yet eaten of the tree of the good of the knowledge of good and evil? So again, we go back to literature. This is a story to explain the unexplainable. It is a mythological construct that helps us to explain the beginning of the duality in the world. And the world is built on opposites, up and down, left and right, good and bad. That's just the duality. Without one, you cannot have reference for the other. So it gets into some real heavy theological considerations, which I'm not sure I'm equipped even to fathom right now.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I love this complicated and heavy theological issues always. So, yeah. No, it's interesting that the concept of Satan is in existence until far later in the description in the Old Testament, right? So the situation in the garden there is much more complicated than we think, and as you pointed out to the origin of sin. This is something I have always thought about, that because if God created everything, well, yeah, it was perfect, and the concept of sin was part of it, basically. If we look at what happened in the garden, if that story is to be taken literally, which I don't dispute those who do. I don't accept it as a literal. But thank you so much for the presentation and for the comment. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, George, for joining in with us. Art, you've unmuted, I believe. Go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Alexander, just a comment and then a question. I think you've been very persuasive in telling us that a lot of these stories are made to fit. You get a solution, one creates a solution, a writer creates a solution to solve a problem and to explain something to make it more, to make the character you're writing about more special. There are several critical scholars regarding the historical Jesus who note that in the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of John, there's no mention of the birthplace of Jesus. And all four of the Gospels, and I might also add the earliest Christian writings that are in the Bible are the letters of Paul, and he nowhere mentions Jesus' birthplace either. There are several modern scholars who suggest, and not so modern scholars, who suggest that the story about Jesus being born in Bethlehem is a construct as well. A story made up to cement Jesus in the line of David, and also to suggest that to try to meet the widespread belief that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem. And I think there's Bart Ehrman, who's a very popular scholar at this time, asserts that. Paula Fredrickson is another. Dominic Crossan, who's a Catholic scholar, believes that, as the late John Meyer also asserted that, and it goes back even to Bultmann suggested that as well. I wanted you to comment on that as to whether or not it is possible that Jesus was not born in Bethlehem at all, but this is another construct to make him fit the Messiah stories widely believed at the time.
Thank you for that comment and question, Art. Yes, it is believed by many scholars that Jesus was not born in Bethlehem. He was born in Nazareth. And as a matter of fact, I believe it was the year 2007 where the Vatican portrayal of the nativity scene was a scene not in Bethlehem, but it was in Nazareth. Because in the nativity scene, they show a room next door to where the child lay. And there in the room next door were all the carpenter's tools that Joseph would have used. So at one point, at least, the Vatican acknowledged the fact that for many, Jesus was not born in Bethlehem. He was born in Nazareth, probably. And the reason why they tend to discount Bethlehem is because it is very clear when Matthew was being written that the writer of Matthew went to the Old Testament and tried to find any passage that could be construed to refer to Jesus. And of course, he found the passage that says, and O you Bethlehem, Ephratah, out of you shall come him who will be called the Son of God, etc. So because of that reference to the Old Testament, Matthew wrote his gospel to match what he thought the Old Testament was prophesying. And that's why we have Bethlehem being the traditional birthplace of Jesus, even to this day, although Bethlehem doesn't look anything like it did back then. But yeah, so the human element in the production of scriptures is not to be overlooked. And I think that accounts for the disparities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, little town of Nazareth doesn't really have the same ring to it, does it?
No, it doesn't.
I'm going to ask Chris to unmute. Chris.
Oh, just chiming in here again of talking about what came to me, and I don't think you mentioned it in your list, Dr. Alexander, is Jochebed, and I put that in the text. The birth of Moses, I think, fits that thing. She's not a barren woman, but again, a great leader comes from obscurity. He was the third born, not the firstborn, and he was hidden in a bulrushes. And as Gina points out, he was rescued by his wonderful sister along with the princess, and ends up being the leader of Israel. So again, a very interesting nativity story, which I thought was interesting. And I raised my hand when Lauren was asking for more hands. So that's just my comment of that one. It's just wonderful to see these repeating themes in Scripture over and over again that tell the story. And I think that should give some meaning to our own lives. That we also come from obscurity. I was born in Loma Linda, for crying out loud. I come from nothing, you know. And I was born in the old hospital to the son of a biologist and a OBGYN nurse, and yet I get to live forever through the grace of Jesus. And I think that gives me hope and meaning today at Christmas time. And I think it should give all of us that. That's the message of Christmas, that there is hope for us beyond this life. And it gives us courage. And I appreciate that.
Yes. Yeah, what you're saying, Chris, is very true. And not only from our contemporary times, but back in biblical times, there's a distinct pattern that the firstborn isn't always the person who is the one favorite of God. Cain was born before Abel. Abel supersedes him. Isaac and Jacob. Isaac and what was his brothers?
Ishmael. Ishmael's the firstborn.
Ishmael was the firstborn, and yet Isaac supersedes him. Jacob was Esau. Esau was the firstborn, and yet Jacob is the one favored. Moses was not the firstborn. His Aaron was the firstborn. Moses takes precedence. So throughout the Bible, you can see the second son repeatedly gaining precedence over the one who would be presumed to be the firstborn and the leader. So yes, that gives hope for all of us.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. And I appreciate people like you who step back and take a look at the scriptures. just from a very critical point of view, not necessarily that it's a point of view of disbelief, but just an analytical point of view. I appreciate that. Ray and Bobby, let's hear what you have to say. Join the discussion here.
Okay. And the presentation here and many of the other presentations and throughout our theology, one thing that has always been of interest to me is the male dominance role from the very beginning. And I've always wondered, from a scholarly point of view, I've never heard anybody say, well, we've looked at this and here's the reason for it taking place, because it seems to start right off in Genesis. So I've often wondered if people just started off on the wrong foot from the very beginning of a lot of belief systems, continued to write down the stories in the way they wanted them to be, as been suggested, so that we come to this point today that basically we've not changed our views on a lot of things, because to me, we seem to have ignored this whole idea of where this male dominance came into being as a fact of life, which to me seems like being a male, I just have to say it, seems to be the root of so many problems. We've left out the other half, and we give them certain roles, as you pointed out. But again, that almighty male.
Well,
So what started it all? What
well,
started this idea?
if we go back to the earliest concept of deity, the original God that humans revered was female. It was the goddess that was worshipped. It was the goddess that was worshipped. You know, when a man comes in from a battle and he's been wounded and he bleeds to death, oh, that's a sad thing. When a woman does that every month and is still alive, and not only that, but she also brings forth new life, what better image of a God could that be? Here is a human being who certainly is a source of life. So the goddess was the initial image of veneration for human beings. Later, when we came down to the time of ancient Israel, then Yahweh had a female consort, and gradually over time, when human beings realized that you have to have the male meeting with the female for the female to produce a child, then patriarchy began to rise. And by the time of Israel, it was clear for a while that Yahweh had a female consort. And then gradually, of course, he had male dominance. And from then on, of course, you have the stories of Garden of Eden, where Eve is blamed for having been the one who introduced evil into the world, pretty much a Pandora's box kind of a story to show how evil came to be. And from then on, patriarchy reigned. And that's my understanding of how all this started.
But the question still keeps there, as somebody put in one of the boxes here about the belief that we're all going to be changed in heaven to be like angels, which to me signifies that there was a screw up at creation. Or they might have both been created at the same time, but down through the ages, they had to have the male first. God, or whoever this being was, must have had some concept of what a female was. He created one. There's so many questions I have about our whole line of theology, and it's like some of it's based upon what we want it to be versus the reality. So I really appreciate your discussions about the stories and what really happens and what really took place. So thanks again.
Sure, welcome, Ray. Ray, I think these are questions that we all wrestle with, and I think I have more questions than I have answers, but I keep pursuing the answers. But in the meantime, I'm learning to live with the questions. And I think that is a definition of what an agnostic is. And I think that's the closest description I can make of myself at this stage of my development.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. I'm kind of over male domination. With that, I'm going to Lauren.
I'm not going to dominate, although I have to say I'm very impressed that I'm much more impressed with Chris Widmer than I was, because when I found out he was born in Loma Linda, that's like being born in Jerusalem
Pedigree.
for Adventists. Yeah, it gives him a really powerful pedigree. Well, what George asked, and somebody before him asked too, and Horace, I don't expect you to have all the answer to this, but it suddenly occurred to me. I wonder how the ancient people, when they thought about these people being born, I mean, they knew how it started. They had to have known how it started, what action you went through, and that it took a man and a woman together to do it. To what extent did they understand the genetic part of this? Did they realize that it was part the woman and part the man, or did they think that the man just implanted his greatness in the woman somehow and she gave birth? I mean, I'm kind of haunted by the note that give me a child or I'll die. How that somehow in this case it was the man's responsibility to give her a child. And in other situations, I have heard, not biblically necessarily, but in other situations, it's the man blames the woman because she couldn't have the child. And you wonder how surely you could look at a child and say, wow, that kid looks like his mother, or she looks like her mother. I mean, somebody must have understood that. I wonder how much they did understand. As I said, Horace, I don't expect you to have all the answers, but it is an interesting question. Give me a child. And if I have a child, what if that child turns out not to be as great as the father, which is often the case with great men, that they don't necessarily have great children. I have a friend who was the daughter of a great Seventh-day Adventist leader. And I asked her one time, she had a brother, and I asked her, well, is your brother like your father? And she said, no, he's got the problem of children of great men. He has never been able to live up to his father's expectations and has been a bit of a disappointment to dad. I thought that was interesting. This relationship, why did the man have to be the one responsible, or why did the male side have to be the one responsible for making a great man like Alexander the Great? He was born of it. His mother had to be impregnated by a god in order to make him so great.
Interesting observation there. Now, to go back to Israel, a fledgling nation would value the fecundity of the women because that was what would ensure the survival of the nation. But it seems as if in a situation with like Jacob and Rachel, all right. It was assumed that men had a role somehow with the women to produce a child. But if he was favoring the other wife and sleeping with her more often, then the chances perhaps would have been lessened. And so she was saying, hey, you need to be more busy with me because I need a child.
Right.
So, I think that was a factor. But speaking of Jacob,
it was his activity, in other
yes,
words, she was blaming him for his inactivity with her.
yes. And maybe he was being more active with Orpah. No, that wasn't Orpah. Rachel, and what was her other name?
Leah.
Leah. He was more busy with Leah because Leah was more productive. He was seeing more fruits of his labor, so to speak.
I see that. Yeah.
And but you see, he at the time was ignorant. The people of the time were ignorant of genetics because this is the same Jacob who, when he was with Laban, his uncle, he took leaves and
That's
branches
right.
and held up in front of the goats and the sheep when they were mating. And he concluded that when they came out speckled and imperfect in
That's
their wool,
right.
that yeah, he thought that that was in, we know better now that that does not in any way alter the DNA of animals when you hold up branches in front of them while they're mating. He was totally ignorant of that. But as far as the biblical account is concerned, it worked. That shows again that Bible writers could only see reality through the eyes and the lenses of their culture, their geography, and their level of knowledge at the time.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't put that together, but yeah, it was a pretty ignorant genetic understanding, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, very good. Thank you. I like that.
I'm going to go to Ed and ask to unmute. Ed, share your thoughts with us today.
Hi, thank you for the presentation, Horace. I want to pick up a little bit on the Immaculate Conception, the idea that Mary was born sinless or was made sinless before she gave birth to Jesus. Now, in Luke 1, I think 35, it said she was told the Holy Spirit, told by the angel the Holy Spirit would come upon her, and then she would then give birth. So, and then later on in the Magnificat, as the Catholic Church calls it, starting in verse 46, she refers to God as her Savior. So I believe part of the Catholic Church belief is that God saved her and in a way made her more holy or even sinless. And as I kind of look at the history of what the Catholic Church believes, or even the Eastern Orthodox Church believes around this, they didn't really resolve the idea that some people believed in this and some people didn't for quite a while, and I think they formalized it in 1854. So I guess my question is, or one of the conclusions I came to was they wanted this Immaculate Conception in order to protect Jesus, the sinful nature that came through Mary.
Yes.
What's your opinion on that?
That was actually the motivation. The idea that the 23 chromosomes from the male and from the female constituted the genetic makeup of a new baby would suggest that Jesus would have been born with sinful genes from Mary. And because Gregor Mendel, who was the Catholic priest who pioneered genetic studies, he presented that dilemma to the Catholic Church. And so they decided to concoct, if you pardon the word, this doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary so as to protect the sinless nature of Jesus. And that was really the motivation behind it. You're correct.
Can I ask a second question?
Sure.
While Mary was pregnant and before Jesus was born, where was Jesus?
Well, that's that was an interesting question. And as I pointed out in that timeline that I showed, Paul didn't know of any birth story. As far as he was concerned, Jesus was a man, a great man, so much so that he was made a prototype of all humanity, and his death became a sacrifice for all humanity. But he was a man, as far as we know. Then you get to Mark, and Mark suggests that Jesus became divine by adoption, at his baptism, you hear this sound, this voice from heaven saying, "This is now my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear ye him." So it suggests that Jesus became divine at his baptism. Then you get back to Matthew coming later. It says, no, he wasn't divine at his baptism. He was born divine. And then Luke, of course, followed in the same vein. And when you get to John, John says, no. He was divine from the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So you can see a progression in the understanding of the divinity of Jesus throughout the Gospels when they are arranged chronologically, when the New Testament writings are arranged chronologically. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Not entirely, because if Jesus was in the womb, then he was no longer in heaven. That's part of why I asked that question.
That's one of the mysteries, I guess, that we can't really fully fathom. And that's why we have a thing called faith. Mm-hmm. Faith is what you resort to when reason cannot take you any farther.
I'm interested in the idea that you mentioned about Gregor Mendel and the fact that sin would be within your chromosomes. Interesting. I'm just wondering if there's any scientific evidence to show sin in your chromosomes.
Sounds like a dissertation topic for a person for a PhD in biology.
That's interesting, isn't it? George, yes. Tishy, you've got another comment for us. Go ahead.
Yeah, I got a second chance here. Thankfully, we got time today. Technically, well, when we look at the description of the creation, both Adam and Eve were created at the likeness or resemblance of the deity, right? It was declared that they were created at God's image.
Yes.
So technically, Jesus could have been incarnated as a woman, right? It was a possibility, because why not? But he came as a man. So there's another question mark there, because if he had been incarnated as a woman, for example, and went through the whole thing as a woman, then it would have resolved race problem with, that's my problem too, with the rejection of women in the Adventist church and all that. And Ray, we could have a GC president woman today if that had happened. But you see, technically, why was it the choice was a man and not a woman? And this shows me too the true history. Man, because of the nature probably of being stronger physically and all that, they took dominance of everything, and they kept this dominance through the ages. And here we are, trying to dismantle this absurdity and start treating women as full human beings as they are, instead of what people did in the past and some still do today. So just a comment like that. Thank you again.
Okay.
Thank you, George. I'm going to go to Dr. Hemmings and ask you to unmute, please. And let us know your thoughts about our topic today. Go ahead.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Just came in, listening to the conversation. It's very important. Let me start by saying it's very interesting what we fail to see in the Bible because we're so busy looking for what we want to see. And we just fail to see some fundamental things. Immediately responding to the previous conversations, if you look at John's gospel first, and Dr. Alexander will tell you that the prologue of John is another creation story. And it's another version of the creation story that was quite prominent. in the first century, second century. And in that version of the creation story, the understanding is that all beings pre-existed. And if you read the writings of Origen, Origen, it's not all beings pre-existed, but Jesus was the only one, the Logos was the only one who did not fall. And so he volunteered to come to earth to help humanity to return to their original space, their original place with, the ground of existence, abyss. I don't want to say God, because God is a very trite term to relate to the ground that is being itself, from which all things come, which we have masculinized or humanized, specifically made masculine. And so we have a text that is patriarchal, and we fail to see the humanity in it. And so we're just perpetuating the sin out of which the text itself evolved. So it's very important that we go back, and it's a whole other conversation. But I just wanted to say, when you read John, the Johannine writings, which include the gospel and the epistles, there are two places where it says that no one has ever seen God. First place is in the prologue, the last verse in the prologue, verse John 1:18. No one has ever seen God. Who is it that reveals who God is? The only what? Son, the begotten Son. The second place, it says, 1 John 4, verse 12, no one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, God lives in us, God's love. And he says, the one who loves is born of God. Being born of God, we often take that literally. Jesus being the only begotten Son has nothing to do with biological birth or any divine version of it. To be begotten means that you're chosen, that you're appointed, to represent God. That's what it means. So when we're talking about nativity, and of course, the Catholics recognize that you can't get a human being to be born out of a male. So they sort of took away Mary's womanhood, as it were, or femininity, or sexuality. They took that away in order to make her, the quote unquote mother of God. So I was saying that. And if we may go back, and I'm going all over the place here, we may go back when we are questioning the so-called God, thank you, Dr. Alexander, for pointing out that original deity was female. And in fact, in scripture, original deity was also female. It is the Ruach Elohim, that's feminine, that came out upon the waters and brought forth the creation. So what we see even in the scripture is a devolution into human carnality, if you may say, the taking over of patriarchy. It was a patriarchal system that took over. A Genesis account of the sin is really a text that is trying to explain why men must dominate women. That's really what it did. It's not telling us that God says men must dominate women. It is giving you a reason why men must dominate women. Okay? Some say it's not a descriptive account, it's not a prescriptive account. It's not saying God saying because you sin, man must rule over you. It is describing what happens as a result of sin. Patriarchy is a result of sin. And there are many Christians who want to remain in this sin culture of patriarchy and continue to have this, male dominating, making woman the scourge of creation, the carnal aspect of creation, and giving all reasons to rule over women, to batter women, to abuse women, and all of that. Anyway, I'm going to shut up now. That's all I have to say today. All right.
Dr. Hemmings, you're just getting on a roll and you're speaking my language. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Dr. Alexander, because I've kind of been focusing on Proverbs 8 at this point, and this is maybe not where you intended to go, and I appreciate if you're not prepared to talk about it, but it talks about wisdom being female and wisdom being present at the creation. And I'm just wondering if it's something you've ever thought about, and why our church doesn't talk about the fact that there was a woman at creation and that wisdom is personified as a female.
it's not a woman, but a feminine energy.
Yeah.
It's feminine, so to speak,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
the wisdom literature of the Bible is directed specifically at men because of the patriarchal nature of Israelite society. You hear lots of descriptions in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes about the qualities of a good wife, the qualities of a good woman. You rarely ever hear anything about what it is to be a good husband, because basically it's for the men to be able to choose good women or to regard women's higher, better qualities. So it is natural then, when you're advocating the pursuit of wisdom, that it is natural for a male to pursue a female. And if you want the male to acquire wisdom, you put wisdom as a feminine entity that men can then readily, by their natural inclination, pursue. I think that explains why wisdom is portrayed as a female, as a in the Proverbs and in Ecclesiastes as well.
Hmm. Interesting. Lauren, I'm going to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say, preach it, Olive. That was great. Thank you. That was enjoyable.
Thanks for not being quiet, Piggy.
Yes, thank you for speaking up. That was marvelous. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Um, there is a great deal of ignorance. Something I've always wondered about, Olive, is when I hear people say, well, the woman was cursed at the beginning, that she had to be under the uh, the control of men and give birth to children, and it's all a curse. And I always say, well, what happened to the curse on the man that he had to always
Work.
hoe in the dirt?
Soil.
Yeah, it doesn't say anything. I've never heard anybody say, "Oh, every man must be a farmer because God cursed him to do that." Yeah, it's just utterly ridiculous. We try to overcome every other curse of sin. We try to heal diseases. We try to reduce our workload. We try to keep people from being unkind to one another, but the woman still has to be kept in her place.
yeah.
Absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, and they bring down this idea that everything female, all female biological functions are essentially carnal, you know, and that's why, motherhood, well, when they do make motherhood into something elevating, it is still done in such a skillful way as to still keep the woman in her place,
It's powerful, powerful stuff. And I know you've written about things like that too. Um, yeah, Chris has his hand up, and I'm going to let him finish up here. But let me just remind you once again, this is our fundraising week, and if they can call for offerings at church, I can call for fundraising at Adventist Day Sabbath Seminar.
Yeah.
Don't do like I sometimes do and say, well, I intend to do that, but don't get around to it. We really depend on this time of year. And I will put a link to the donate page here in the chat. The other thing is I want to say is that next week we're going to do one more Christmas theme, and that's going to be on a study of the virgin or the young woman in Isaiah. So we're going to dig into that again. And Warren is one of our familiar teachers here. We have him fairly often, and he's going to dig into that, the concept of Mary being a virgin versus a young woman, and everything that goes along with that. So Chris has the last word, and then we're going to sign off for today.
Oh, well, at the risk of being here too much, thank you, Lauren. I just love to say, to Paul's reasoning, where, the woman was created second and she was deceived first, and his logic there in his discussion. I like to say that the curse, whatever curse may have been in Genesis, the curse ends at the cross. The cross restores humanity. We are to live in heaven as if it has already come. The kingdom of God has already come. And that is my ultimate argument for women's ordination and all the other discussions. The curse ends at the cross. Thank you, Jesus.
Amen. I agree with that. And thank you, Dr. Alexander. This was marvelous.